What if two of the most polarizing political scandals in modern history, the Russia hoax and the Jeffrey Epstein network, weren't separate scandals, but in fact part of the same shadow game perpetrated by the same shadowy figures? My guest, Geoff Gilson, says the narrative you've been fed, Republicans versus Democrats, Kremlin spies versus deep state patriots, is all theater. The real story? The same covert power networks pull the strings in both cases, and they're playing for stakes far higher than partisan victory. Geoff Gilson isn't guessing. He's been inside the machinery. He once wrote speeches for Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, and for decades he's followed the money trails, intelligence footprints, and political alliances that never make the headlines. Now he's bringing us to the closed-door Alaska summit, where Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, and perhaps Volodymyr Zelensky will be meeting, far from the Washington press corps. Officially, it's about peace. Unofficially, well, we're about to find out. Geoff says it was about, or is about, territory swaps, energy control, and leverage that could redraw the map of Eastern Europe and rewrite the global balance of power. From Manhattan boardrooms to Moscow safe houses to the icy backrooms of Alaska, Geoff is here to connect the dots between scandals, summits, and the shadow networks that profit from both. And if he's right, the Russia saga, the Epstein operation, and the Ukraine war are all chapters in the same hidden history. And the ending will change everything you think you know about who runs the world. Geoff is a political strategist, investigative author, and former speechwriter for British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. His book, Maggie's Hammer, explores the covert networks of intelligence operatives, financiers, and political dynasties operating beyond democratic oversight. Drawing on decades of research, Geoff exposes the hidden connections between geopolitical crises, financial conspiracies, and scandals like the Russia investigation and Jeffrey Epstein's blackmail operation. He's a frequent commentator on intelligence, power politics, and the shadow world, where official narratives are crafted and reality is buried. Geoff, welcome. How are you?
I'm fine. Richard, thank you for having me on your show, and delighted to be here.
So you say the Russia hoax and the Epstein scandal, not separate stories at all. How can two seemingly opposite political scandals actually be two sides of the same coin?
Well, that's obviously what we're going to be talking about. I think for your listeners, your viewers, you can pretty much work out for yourself that something else is going on, because you say, oh, wait a minute, Epstein, that's been around for a while. Why is it suddenly back again? And Russiagate, there were two inquiries. There was Mueller and there was Durham. Why is that back again? Why won't they go away? Well, you could say they haven't been resolved. Or is there something else going on? There is. And the short version is this, that behind all of this is a covert networks around the world, arms dealing, money laundering, trafficking, and corrupt intelligence agencies, especially those in Britain, America, and Israel, and involvement with the Russian mafia. Those are the forces that are actually primarily organizing behind the scenes and wielding influence. Of course, the interesting thing is, no one's ever heard of me before. How on earth do I know this? How did I come across this? What is the trail that led to this? And where does it all begin? Richard, if you don't mind, and I'm more than happy to interrupt me as I go along, I want to tell you a story, because my story and the story of how I believe this relates to Russiagate and the Epstein scandal begins in the 80s. And that's exactly where Maggie's Hammer begins, in the 80s. Two things were happening in the 80s to set the scene for what is going on now. The first is, and I realize that for some people, this is not within necessarily their living memory. And I have to keep reminding myself of that. There was the Iran-Iraq war.
Yeah.
Now, people may remember the moniker Iran-Contra. That's what this was about. Iran and Iraq went to war in 1980. The United Nations imposed an arms embargo on both nations. But they needed arms. It was a bloody war. It was a long war, lots of casualties, and they needed weaponry. But the UN had placed an embargo on dealing arms to the two countries. So this was seen as an opportunity for intelligence agencies and backdoor governments to become involved in arms dealing to Iran and Iraq. Now, just to step to one side for a moment, one of the primary sources for the information in my book, especially about Israeli intelligence, is a gentleman by the name of Ari Ben Menashe. This Arabian name that is known to some people and others not. Very interesting, very complicated man. I've met him several times. I kind of like him. Yeah. He's a little like Jason Alexander from Seinfeld, but way more dangerous.
Mossad, right? We're talking Mossad.
Well, we're talking Mossad, and it's interesting. Sometimes they denounce, they deny there's anything to do with him, but he's still there. And sometimes senior members of Israeli intelligence have said, yes, he's one of ours. I believe he's a loose cannon, and he is part of the Israeli intelligence foreign propaganda effort. In any event, one of the things that he said to me as I was researching this book and trying to find out what was going on was that too many people, too many commentators look at what's going on now or where it came from, and they try to look at black and white. They try to find an intelligence purpose or a military purpose or a political purpose. And Harry said, what is important to understand is that in the 80s, there was so much money to be made initially out of the Iran-Iraq war. People were in it just for the money. They were trying to do things for their own country. Harry was a counter-terrorism advisor at the time to the Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Shamir. But he was also making money for Likud, and he was making money for Israeli intelligence and himself. Now, $80 billion of arms were sold to Iran, $50 billion to Iraq. That's the first thing to understand. The second, it relates to Harry, is that in 1972, 12 Israeli athletes were killed at the Munich Olympics by a Palestinian terrorist organization. Israel's establishment, this theocracy, is politically divided. You don't see this in other parts of the world. Actually, the place you do kind of see is in communism, but it is heavily divided politically. So whether it's the Department of Agriculture or Intelligence or the Cabinet Secretary or the Prime Minister's office, the staffing is roughly divided in line with the political power of various parties in Parliament. So back in 1972, there was a left wing within Mossad and a right wing. And at that time, they split in their views about what should be done to protect Israel. The left wing said, we've got to keep it to the Middle East. This isn't anybody else's fight. This is ours. The right wing said, that's no longer the case. They brought it to Munich, and they are taking it elsewhere. We need now to go into other countries and fight our foes where we find them, whether it's in Europe or America. And at the same time, we need to start an operation of influence. And we need not only to undermine the terrorists where we find them, we need to exert influence on governments of foreign countries so that they are backing Israel and not backing the Palestinian Arabs. Now, you may already begin to see where this could be leading in terms of Epstein and perhaps Russiagate, but I'll continue with the story. So Ari was one of the primary figures on the right wing of Mossad trying to begin this new overseas effort, and he found himself based in London. London is very important, which is one of the things I use from Maggie's hammer, is if you want to understand what's going on at the moment, you have to look at the 80s. And if you look at the 80s, you have to pay attention to London. And if you want to know what's going on in London, my book provides one of the best roadmaps for what was going on in London. And perhaps a little bit later in the show, if we have time, I'll tell real viewers how it started for me, because I was an ordinary guy living in a small town in England. How did I come across all of this? But Ari was based in London, primarily because of the City of London. The City of London is one of the primary financiers of covert operations around the world. And your viewers may not quite understand it. Okay, let me try and say it in cultural terms. Think of Jack Sparrow and Pirates of the Caribbean, and the East India Company. The East India Company was a private financier out of London. It was actually a real company. That's how the City of London started. Private finance corporations financing the British Empire and bringing back the ill-gotten gains to London. And to this day, London is still viewed by many intelligence writers as the centre for covert operations. But that's why Harry was in London. He was also in London because at that time, Margaret Thatcher's government was in power. And the Conservative government of Margaret Thatcher and its successors has always leaned towards the Arabs and the Palestinians rather than the Israelis. So they were one of the first targets. And what happened in the 80s is Harry and others set up in London the operation that then became quite familiar in the devices that we used. I don't know if you read it. About 2 weeks ago, the Netherlands finally declared Israel to be a terrorist organization because of the influence it had been wielding in the Netherlands for the last few decades. This started in London in the 80s, and it has been transferred to other countries around the world as a model.
If I could just jump in for a moment, because this gentleman you've been talking about, Ari, from Mossad, although he may deny, was it not this gentleman that divulged that Robert Maxwell, of course, the father of Ghislaine Maxwell, who languishes in prison for sex trafficking, that he witnessed a meeting between Robert Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein back in the 80s, and that Maxwell was recommending Epstein perhaps assist in part of the arms trading that was going on in Iran and Iraq, and Ari thought that Epstein was just out of his depth.
This is very interesting, Richard. I'm coming to this, but you're absolutely right. That's one of the cogs in the machine, one of the pieces in the machine, to find Ari in and out of this story because of what he was doing as the Prime Minister of Israel and the right wing of Israeli intelligence out of London. And these allegations first, I think, came to light in 2019. And when I first was informed about them, because I wasn't provided with them directly, Harry. When I was first informed about them, I read the details, and it was fascinating because if you read those allegations, leaving aside all the child trafficking, which was personal to him, all of the details about London and arms dealing and money laundering and Harry and Robert Maxwell were almost picture perfect, a reflection of what the subject of my book, Hugh Simmons, was doing. And that's why it had about it the ring of truth. People said, is this true? And I said, I don't know. But does it have about it the ring of truth? I said, this is precisely what I described in Maggie's Hammer. And this is precisely what Hugh Simmons was involved in. Interesting that I never came across the name Epstein, but so much of this was compartmentalized. I don't think that Epstein ever came across Hugh Simmons and Nick Davis, who was Robert Maxwell's foreign editor of the Daily Mirror newspaper in London. But that was a whole different operation going on. And Hugh was directly involved in organizing arms sales for British intelligence through Ari and with Robert Maxwell. Ari also told me that he had personally been present at meetings between Robert Maxwell and Hugh Simmons. So this is what was going on in London in the 80s. And so to find that Epstein was in London at the same time didn't surprise me. And then to trace him back to New York afterwards is one of the reasons why I'd say when you look at Epstein and you are repelled by what he was doing sexually, if that's where you stop, and it's important that it should end, no one's minimizing it, but if that's all you look at, then you're not seeing the whole story. And if the only Maxwell you look at is Ghislaine Maxwell, you're actually looking at the wrong Maxwell. And I was talking about Robert Maxwell 10 years ago, but I was, in an echo chamber. No one else was looking at Robert Maxwell. They were looking at Ghislaine Maxwell. Ghislaine Maxwell was Epstein's sex kid. Robert Maxwell is the gentleman with whom he did arms deals.
Right, which is interesting because the official narrative is that the two worlds, Jeffrey Epstein and the Maxwells, really didn't converge until sometime in the 90s when he just started, dating Ghislaine Maxwell. But this, according to Ari, this goes back to perhaps, the early to mid-'80s, this relationship.
Even now, I just checked yesterday to see what is the answer. The answer is, what does Google turn up? What does artificial intelligence turn up? And you're absolutely right, Richard. Their story about Epstein still starts in the 90s. And this is where it gets very interesting, because you don't know who or what to believe. And what I've had to do, because I'm not a member of an intelligence agency, I don't have resources, I'm not financed by a newspaper, I'm entirely on my own, which is one of the reasons it took me 30 years to get anywhere close to an answer about what happened to Hugh Simmons. And by the way, the whole story started, we'll get to this, because my friend Hugh Simmons then turned up mysteriously dead in some woods near where we lived in 1988. That's what started me off on this whole thing. But what I've had to do is just go out and speak to people firsthand, and 30% of what most intelligence agents tell you is a lie, because that's what they're in the business of. They're in the business of making themselves important in lying, and it's very difficult to know what to believe and how much importance to place to it. So one could look at the allegations that Ari has made about Epstein and say, well, he's just trying to be the center of another story. However, the ring of truth about him is so strong for me that, as I say, it makes sense. I can detail things that were going on in the 80s, and they sound like the same thing. So I believe it has some truth.
So it sounds like Robert Maxwell was trying to bring Jeffrey Epstein into Mossad with some sort of a relationship, and Mossad was not necessarily overly impressed with Jeffrey Epstein. In fact, I think Ari just said this guy was clueless.
I've heard this. At the same time, Richard, there are elements of Mossad who regularly denounce Ari. And then occasionally when he actually pushes it, when he was up on charges, criminal charges back in 1991. And in court he said, you can't try me. I was part of Iran-Contra. I'm a member of his Israeli intelligence. And everyone denied it. And finally, a former deputy director of Mossad went on record as saying, yes, he's one of ours. And no, you can't put him on trial, because what he has to say is not something the rest of the world needs to hear about in a criminal trial. But going back to the 80s, so I'm just doing that point. So it's difficult to know. Are they saying this about Epstein because they don't want us looking? Or is it true? You don't know. What you have to do, what people like you and me have to do, because we're not in the book, is we have to get what evidence and information we can firsthand or through the research and check it against other sources to see if it makes sense. I've had more than one person say to me, that famous line, which is being well worn at the moment, yes, but where's the proof? You're absolutely right. Well, let me just go out and check and see if someone's waving bank statements on the street corner. You're not going to find proof. What you have to do is put together the best bits you can and then let other people decide whether they believe it or not.
Robert Maxwell, very interesting history. At times it seems like he was MI6. At other times it seems like he may have been a double agent with the KGB. And then, of course, there are, I think, some pretty credible allegations that it was Mossad that really was his financial backer in gobbling up all of these newspapers.
Well, there are many different stories, and I got presented with all of them as I was researching this. I came across Robert Maxwell because Ari told me that they'd been in business together. He didn't actually come out and put it like that. I had to confront him in a Montreal hotel and say, you keep talking about Hugh and you and Robert Maxwell and Margaret Thatcher as if they were, you were observing, as if you researched it. But I think you were actually doing business with Hugh Simmons. And it's the only time Ari's gone frosty on me. And let me tell you, you don't want somebody in Mossad going frosty on you, 8 stories up in a Montreal hotel. And he said, what he required? Why didn't you say that? So I told him, and he stopped, and finally the Harry sparkle came back, and he smiled. He said, well, yes, but that wasn't the name he was using. I said, okay, all right, well, we're back on firm territory. So he was actually dealing with them. But just go back to the 80s for a moment. So you have Harry in London recruiting Robert Maxwell, working with Robert Maxwell, and working with Hugh Simmons and possibly with Epstein. What has that got to do with anything? Harry was right involved in the Israeli, American, and British attempts to sell arms to both Iran and Iraq. In this situation, Israel didn't care who was selling arms to. It was selling arms to two countries who were merely killing each other. They were both enemies of Israel, so they didn't care. And everyone else had different reasons for being involved. It's interesting, Richard. I have read a number of well-sourced books talking about these networks from the 80s, given grand names like the Enterprise and Octopus and the Syndicate and things like this. And almost all of them missed an important element, which, to be honest, my book doesn't miss, which is British intelligence. And British intelligence was involved in the 80s and what was going on. When Margaret Thatcher came to power in 1979, she was faced with a country that was bankrupt. There was no money in the public purse. A lot of industry was nationalised and pampered and was not making money. She knew she had to make the budget balance, and that would take cuts in spending and tax rises, which would deflate the economy. She also knew that she would have to denationalise a lot of industries, and that would also have a deflationary impact. She didn't want to cause total mass unemployment, so she had to do something. And what she did was twofold. First of all, she massively expanded the arms industry in Great Britain. At the time, Great Britain was like the number 8 arms exporter in the world. It became the number 2. 1 in 5 people in Great Britain at the moment who are employed are associated with some industry connected with the arms industry. 2 weeks ago, Keir Starmer signed the largest arms deal any British government has ever signed, and he is a Labour Prime Minister. Even the trade unions in Great Britain support the arms industry. The second thing that she did was that she pimped out Britain's military and intelligence services. They were still tremendously well integrated and infrastructured and organised, arising from the British Empire. But the British Empire had gone. So essentially she had no money, had a military and an intelligence operation that was one of the best in the world and had little to do. She pimped them out primarily to the Americans, but also to the Israelis. So what you had as a nexus for these covert operations in the 80s was the Americans, the British, and the Israelis. But most people miss out the Brits, and they miss a lot because of it and what Harry was doing in London. So they were selling arms, all three, to Iran and Iraq. Hundreds of millions of dollars in profit and nowhere to put it. That's where Robert Maxwell came in, and Hugh Simmons and a few other people like him came in. Hugh Simmons was a lawyer, a solicitor in London. I worked for him as a senior employee. He's my friend, my political mentor. We were both of us trying to get into Parliament at the time, and he was very close to Margaret Thatcher, and through him I was also known to Margaret Thatcher. But he was a solicitor in London at the time who specialised in what they rather trimmily called money management, money and tax management. We now know it as money laundering. And so he joined up with Robert Maxwell. Robert Maxwell had very close contacts with the communist dictators in Eastern Europe. Although communists, they needed to do business to make money so that they could exchange foreign exchanges around the world. And at the same time, they had a very thriving black market, because in communist countries you had to. And the black market was run by the East European and Russian mob, and a singular individual who was important. And if you Google him in connection with almost any name, you'll find him connected. It's Semyon Moyevich. It's spelled Mogilevich, but it's Semyon Moyevich, who was connected to Donald Trump, connected to Robert Maxwell, connected to Harry. He was given an Israeli passport for what he was doing to help. But that combination laundered the profits from Iran-Contra and the arms sales to Iran and Iraq into Eastern Europe under Robert Maxwell's control with the assistance of Hugh Simmons and his money laundering capabilities. That pretty much sets the scene for what was going on in the 80s. That then carried forward into the 90s and through the noughts. All of these networks, once you set them up, they want to continue in existence. They had a raw time in the 90s because not a lot was going on.
I was just going to say, the end of the Cold War, now all of a sudden you have these intelligence agencies. What, now they're basically guns for hire?
They're guns for hire. And it was a bit of a bad time. There was a lot of activity in Africa and in Azerbaijan and Armenia, but not really central to our story at all. Then comes the war on terror. And again, I don't mean to minimize any of the human cost of this. We're talking the real politic of covert operations and secret power brokers. And they are not very moral people. My friend Hugh Simmons, I regarded him as a friend, but he was a bit of a rogue, but he was not that moral about what he did in terms of activities, as I'd later find out. The war on terror was bonanza time for private contractors and private networks. And the whole worldwide network, Harry Ben-Menashe, came back to life. Now, in the meantime, as I mentioned, my friend Hugh Simmons turned up dead in the woods in 1988. That's very interesting because a few years later, Robert Maxwell turned up dead in the Mediterranean. When I got around to speaking to Harry beginning in 1993, he said, the end of the 80s saw a lot of cleaning up. People who were on dirty laundry lists were taken care of. And I spoke to him at length about Robert Maxwell. And that's very interesting. He began by saying it wasn't us, it was the CIA. Robert Maxwell was helping himself to CIA money to keep his media empire afloat. Well, what about these claims that Mossad was behind his media empire? Nothing to do with this, nothing at all. When I spoke to my British intelligence contacts, they said, Mossad. It was Mossad. It was Israeli money, and Harry didn't much care for that. And so it goes around the house. I had exactly the same conversation about Hugh Simmons. Harry swears blind. He and his people had nothing to do with Hugh's death. However, it was Harry's book that got me onto Harry, because Harry's book, Profits from War, there's a section, one paragraph in the middle of it, where he was instructed in 1988, when the Iran-Iraq war ended, to stop the pipeline to Iran. They didn't mind Iran, they minded Iran. While the war was going on, they were happy to have people sell arms to both sides. They were happy to help launder the profits. Once the war ended, they weren't so much concerned about Iran, but they were very unhappy about Saddam Hussein, who is now in possession of a quite efficient military capability, including missiles and burgeoning nuclear, biological, and chemical weaponry. On a side note, if you want to come back about this, happy to talk about it later in the program. This notion that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq when the Americans arrived in 2003, rubbish. Yes, there were. Yes, there were. And I've been warned off by the CIA even talking about it. Yes, there were. Anyway, so Saddam Hussein, Israel wanted to cripple him. So he was tasked by Yitzhak Shamir specifically with stopping the Iraqi operation, of which Hugh was part. And this one paragraph in Harry's book says that in November of 1988, Harry was tasked with drawing up a list and recruiting and deploying Mossad hit teams into Europe to take out relevant people. One of whom, I believe, was Hugh, who died on November 15th, 1988. Harry began by saying nothing to do with us. He said it was British intelligence. British intelligence said it was him. They both said it was the CIA. I got warned off by the CIA in a very interesting situation in London. Somebody turned up at my place of work, pretended to be an employee, invited me back to my house, told me to stop doing what he was doing. When I went to the house the next day, the house was empty. You know, all in the book. Fascinating, frightening time. And so you don't know who to believe. Harry, eventually, I was given information that suggested that, amongst other things, and being a senior officer in the British MI6, Hugh had also been trained as an assassin. which I did not know. When I raised this with Harry was very quiet. He was on the telephone, and he said, "There's a lot about your friend you didn't know." And then she said, "Geoff, that's why I'm telling you, that's not the sort of person we would have taken out." And his last things, he said, "Look, your friend was too many laundry lists by the end of the decade. He was too clever by half. He thought he could con everyone. And there came a point where he simply couldn't deliver to everyone, and he had to be taken out." So let's get back to 1991. Hugh dies in 1988. My information is that the next person to become a money laundering advisor to Robert Maxwell was a gentleman by the name of Bill Browder, which is a name we'll come back to in the story later. Then Robert Maxwell turns up dead in the Mediterranean in 1991. As I was just saying, one of the issues with these networks is once you set them up, they don't disappear. There were all these bank accounts in Eastern Europe. There were the networks setting arms and engaging in mercenary activity around the world. It didn't disappear, but Robert Maxwell had disappeared. So what happens to that network? We enter slightly difficult territory. Let's talk about Donald Trump for a moment.
Yeah.
Donald Trump in the 80s, very successful real estate developer in New York and Atlantic City, hit money trouble. Everyone hit money trouble at the end of the 80s. He was not getting much joy out of American banks, once bitten, twice shy. And the information that I have researched is that at that time, amongst other sources, he made contact with Russian oligarchs and Russian mafia, including Semyon Moyedovich, and began laundering money through New York. At about this time, or just before it, Donald Trump had been very actively involved with Robert Maxwell. There is evidence of a meeting between Maxwell and Trump and Epstein, and an Egyptian arms dealer by the name of Adnan Khashoggi,
Yes.
who was very important now, I think, Iran Contra, on a yacht on the River Thames in London, which is why I slightly raised an eyebrow when Mossack pretended that they weren't very impressed with Epstein. I think they may not have been impressed with his sexual activity, but he was apparently there at that meeting. Those contacts continued into New York when Maxwell took over the New York Daily News. And there's not much known about what was going on, but here I take a slightly speculative leap. And that is, I believe that Donald Trump and his new money laundering operations took over Robert Maxwell's money laundering operations and the operations that were in Eastern Europe. Now, if you have Donald Trump and his organizations involved with Semyon Moyedovich, involved with money laundering out of Eastern Europe and Russia and Moscow and to London, you begin to see, you've already seen a connection to Epstein, you begin to see a very different connection to Russiagate, which is where I'm about to come to.
When you say he took over the money laundering operation, what does that mean? I mean, how does one take?
I have to be very, very honest here, Richard. What I can do is, in my mind, is that when I started investigating this in 1988, when I say this, I mean the death of my friend, I didn't start out by looking for all this. I thought when I went asking questions of people in 1988, someone would turn around and say, "Oh, it's in a bank account over there in Grand Cayman," and that would have been it. I didn't find the money. No one found the money that Hugh had stolen. The reasons he did. People are going to have to read the book for some of the details. I'm skipping around here. Hugh turned up dead in local woods in 1988 in mysterious circumstances. $7 million was missing from his law firm, which was a sole practitioning law firm, but I happened to be his senior employee. If you go and talk to the police in Amersham, in England, a little town near where I live, and ask questions about Geoff Gilson, they'll say, "Geoff, Mr. Gilson, yes, is he going to give us the money yet?" That was their final position upon me. And I was like, well, in the greatest respect, Richard, I wouldn't be talking on your radio show in 2025 if I had $7 million.
True enough.
As much as I'm enjoying the experience. But that I said that doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that he would take the money. I went looking other people did it. I started asking the right questions in the wrong places, and a roller coaster of activity began. And then I found my way to these revelations. So through the 90s, not very much was happening. In Russia, communism collapsed. Yeltsin began his experiment with capitalism. It was a very unsuccessful experiment. It was too much too soon. Putin took over and calmed things down in 2000 and tried to make things work better. But at the same time, he'd been in the KGB. He had connections with the Russian mob and with Semyon He wasn't above making a buck or two himself and for the senior Russian oligarchs with whom he was involved. The scheme that operated in Moscow after 2000, if not before, was if you set up a firm in Moscow, you have to have some Russian directors. They have access to the money, they have access to the identities, and they will cream money off the top, and they will launder it overseas, not least through operations like that of Donald Trump. Now, those are the allegations. There's a very detailed article in a journal called Mother Jones, which I don't normally read, but this was very well researched, which sets out all of the details, and there are other investigations as well into what was going on. And it appears to have a ring of truth to it. Bill Browder, the financier who had been rising from Maxwell after I made his symptoms, turns up in Moscow in the late 90s, early noughts, sets up his own investment firm called Hermitage Capital Investment Asset Management, gets his Russian directors, has a Russian accountant called Sergei Magnitsky. Sergei turns around and says, they're robbing you blind, man. You need to do something about it. Bill Browder complains to the Russian tax registry or whatever. They respond by bringing charges against him for tax evasion. He escapes the country. Sergei Magnitsky is arrested, dies in a Russian prison of torture. Bill Browder develops a conscience, goes around Europe and Washington, and gets Washington in 2012 to pass the Magnitsky Act. Little known act. No one really knows very much about it. But this act, in response to what happened, says any and all assets involved with people who are involved with Hermitage shall be frozen. Problem is, Putin is in for 50% of all money laundered. So there is this pathetic little asset management firm, which is of no importance at all to anyone, except they killed Sergei. But because Putin is getting 50% of the laundered proceeds, he is down, his allegedly $70 billion of assets potentially could be frozen if anyone bothers to enforce the Magnitsky Act. So he wanted to undo and repeal the Magnitsky Act. And that's what brings us to Russiagate. The narrative has been, and is still, even though presidents like Obama and Biden tend to pretend otherwise, and you all remember this is within the memory of your viewers. And I remember this, I'm not the Trump voter, but I remember that in 2016 to 2017, the narrative that was being leaked to the press was the Russians tried to influence the election. They did so in conjunction with Donald Trump. They tried to do various things to affect the outcome of the election. It worked.
They hacked the DNC server.
And that's why Hillary Clinton lost. Now, you and I both know, even though we may come from different places, that was the narrative sold for 2 years until Mueller refused to endorse it. And then Durham said, exposed it as a hoax. And now, bless his heart, unlike President Obama, he says, no, the narrative was always, they tried, but they failed. Never said anything about Donald Trump. Dude, yes, you did. I remember the press articles at the time. I've still got them on my computer. But the truth is that the Russians didn't just try to support Donald Trump. They set up an operation, including a female lawyer, whose name I can never remember, but she pops up everywhere. They set up an operation to try and support any and all Washington politicians, including Donald Trump. There's information about a meeting that Donald Trump Jr. had at the Mayflower in June of 2016. And he's repeated as coming out to say, I'll be honest, I put my hand on my arse. I was in this meeting trying to get opposition research on Hillary. Why not? Maybe a bit shady, but why not? And all this woman did, he said, all this woman did for half an hour was talk about this thing called the Magnitsky Act. What is the Magnitsky Act? And what it was being told was, if you repeal the Magnitsky Act, we'll give you anything you want. They did the same thing with Hillary and the Steele dossier. She was being sold information by Russia about Donald Trump, true or not, to try and get the Magnitsky Act. They made contact with various Congress people of different colors. I got this information from a 44-page report produced by an organization called Democracy Coalition, which examined the Steele dossier and followed the trail on its own, which very few other people did. And they said the real story is Putin was trying to suborn everyone to get the Magnitsky Act to hide his own money laundering. And the reason people don't want to look too closely into Epstein is because it might lead to all this money laundering activity, whether it's by corrupt intelligence agencies or Trump. The reason they don't want to look at Russiagate too clearly, exactly the same reason. It leads back to the same people, it leads back to money laundering, and on both sides, Clinton and or Trump. So those are why the two things are connected. Now, there's clearly a power play. Is Trump the good guy trying to clean the house and clean up law enforcement and intelligence? I think to some extent, yes.
Yeah.
Is he involved in some extent to this? Probably. Was Hillary involved? Yes. I was asked the other day, well, okay, I'm getting a headache now. Is there no black and white? No. Were they all involved? Yes. So why is it all being brought to the surface? In the hope that someone will stick to someone. It's a mess, Richard. But if you look behind the immediate Epstein story and sex, as little as it is, and the Russiagate story and Obama, you find the same things. Powerful forces that began their interest in covert activities like arms dealing and money laundering back in the 80s, seeking to protect their power and their influence today.
So is this why the promises during the campaign to release the Epstein files, and then that was, I think, horribly fumbled by Attorney General Pam Bondi, now claiming there's no there, even though she said the list was on her desk. Is that why they've basically tried to make everyone forget that? Because it's everybody's implicated. Everybody's.
I'm going to give you my personal opinion here, Richard. I think, and it's my commentary about the Alaska summit, which will, if we have time, we'll come to that. Donald Trump's main interest in Trump 2.0, Trump 1.0, as far as he is concerned and his supporters is concerned, was 50-50, success and failure. He wanted to do a good job. He bought into the establishment, believing they would work with and for him. They didn't. They worked against him. And I think that's a very fair summation of how Trump 1.0 worked. Trump 2.0 was, I learned my lesson, and this time I'm going to use my people as much as I can. And I believe that Trump's raison d'etre is, I want to make business work for America. I want to make business work in America. I want to make America and business work around the world. That's my, motif, if you like. That's what I'm about. That's what the Alaska Summit is about. That's what my presidency is about. I don't quite know. To some extent, I think when he said he was going to release the Epstein files, there was some politics going on. We all know that Trump knew Epstein. I actually went away and did some research just this past week because I'd become somewhat irritated by some of my good liberal friends saying, Trump, Epstein, in bed together, literally otherwise. And I said, look, if this was the case, then why didn't Biden prosecute? Why didn't Obama prosecute? Come on. And I went away, and the primary thing I come back with is, and let's understand this, Trump is no angel. No one's pretending Trump is an angel. This man constructed buildings in New York and Atlantic City, two of the most corrupt places in the world. You don't do that and come away as a bouncing baby angel. You just don't. But although he was friends with Epstein pretty much up to 2003 when the first allegations were made about Epstein, everybody in New York was friends with Epstein. He lived in what I believe was described as the largest, most expensive mansion in New York. Everyone was invited to his parties. Everybody was on his aircraft. But there is absolutely zero evidence that has been presented that Donald Trump was involved in what was going on.
In fact, the attorneys or the lawyers representing some of Epstein's victims went public and said that one of the only people that returned their calls when they were trying to find out more information was Donald Trump, and he gave them all the time that they wanted. He told them everything that he knew about Epstein. He was the only one that cooperated. Doesn't sound like someone who's implicated.
Richard, again, I'm not a Trump voter, but I believe in being even-handed, and I believe in looking at things with reality to understand what's going on. And I was going to say exactly that point. My understanding is the victims' families said in 2009, he was the only person who helped, and the lawyers said his information was not only credible, it was useful. If he was giving information that was useful and credible, and it involved him, he'd be in prison at the moment. I think that much of what he did during the campaign was probably politically motivated to keep the attention of MAGA. That may or may not be reprehensible. He may end up getting a lot of egg on his face. Where he is now, I'm not entirely certain if there is nothing in the files that can be released. I think there's a bit of a dance going on. I believe to some extent it may be the case that Donald Trump has seen some of what is involved behind Epstein and has taken the view that it is so awful and so terrible that what little trust Americans may have, what little faith they may yet have in their government would be undone. And he doesn't want to see that happen. That may be the case. It may be the case that he is seeing the files and realizes it leads back to money laundering and arms deal matters that he doesn't want released. I don't know. I honestly think he doesn't really care. He is in his second term. I don't think he's serious about standing, but his time in elections is over. The attitude I get is, you can print what you like. It doesn't matter. I don't care. I'd rather you debate things like that. I have grandchildren, but it's not going to hurt me politically because this is it for me. This is it's not going to stop me doing what I'm doing. So I'm not terribly much. I don't think there's going to be any great revelation, even if they expose the files. Why Pam Bondi is not simply releasing what she's got, I have no clue. But I don't think it's going to implicate Trump, except I do believe there's money laundering stuff going on.
All right, so let's turn to Alaska. Why do you believe this summit between Trump and Putin, and as recent as about an hour ago, Trump was hinting that Zelensky still might be invited. But as it stands right now, as we're recording this, no Zelensky. It's Trump, mano a mano. Well, some other, I believe the finance minister from Russia will be there, and Lavrov, the foreign secretary, and so forth. But it'll be Trump and Putin for the most part. What are they up to? This isn't obviously just about Ukraine. You don't bring your finance minister to this meeting if it's just about trying to strike a peace deal in Ukraine. There's something else going on here. What is it?
In my opinion, having not only traced covert money trails that Putin and Trump are involved in, but just looking at modern day politics and so on, this summit is theatre. At the moment, with all the technologies you have in the world, there can be no safe electronic communication between Trump and Putin. And I think a point has been reached in relations between them and between the two countries, where Trump and Putin need to be eye to eye, face to face, in a room with no one else, and talking one-on-one to get certain things clear, to make absolutely certain between them that they feel they're on the same page. I don't think this. I think you're right. I don't think this summit has anything to do with Ukraine, and I will be very surprised if Zelensky is invited. If he is, I don't believe he will be in a private meeting. If he is, then there's a different way of looking at this, which is maybe a come to Jesus moment. Trump and Putin, in my opinion, with this summit, want to reset the business relationship between America and Russia. And if people are spending their Friday looking at what's going on, I've got better things to do, lest they aren't. But if they are, what you want to be looking for amongst all the fanfare is a private meeting between Trump and Putin. No advisors, maybe one translator each, no advisors, private meeting, no recording, no electronics, lasting more than half an hour. Less than half an hour, it's theatre. More than half an hour, they're talking serious business. And what they want to be doing is looking past Ukraine. Trump wants America back in Moscow. After 2022, hundreds of the American companies left Moscow, including large companies like Coca-Cola and Nike and Starbucks. And Trump wants, because his theme is American business, he wants to be back in Moscow. Putin wants to be doing business with America again. He may pretend that he's going great guns in deals with India, China, and North Korea. But no, he's not. It is hurting his country. He's hanging on by a thread. A few military gains in Ukraine is not keeping people at bay. He knows he needs to start doing business again with America. But for both leaders, Ukraine is an irritation. I believe, as a matter of real politics, not human justice, they both know what the answer is. And the answer is Russia's going to get the 4 districts in the east and Crimea. Ukraine is going to be neutral, and Europe will guarantee the security of Ukraine, not America. I've been asked, well, yes, but surely there's money to be made out of Ukraine. Trump's made his money out of Ukraine. He signed the mineral agreement. He's got everything he wants out of Ukraine. He wants to do business with Putin. But I think that Putin's ready to do something with Trump, and Trump's ready to do something with Putin, but they haven't yet been able to speak face to face, eye to eye, and dot the I's and cross the T's. And I believe in that meeting, Trump would be saying, okay, I'm prepared to get along with this Ukraine deal so we can do business. But Vlad, you've got to stop. You've got to do the ceasefire right now, no more advance. And Putin's going to say, if you are serious about doing business in Moscow, if you're going to lift the sanctions and do business, I'll call the ceasefire tomorrow, but not partial. It's got to be complete. It can be staged, but that's what's going to happen. And if Zelensky's in the room, fluttering, saying, what about me? It's going to be, Trump is going to say, Vlad, I promised you, Vlad, I promised you that you would be the guy to make the decision on this for Ukraine. So there's your decision. 1, accept the deal, or 2, carry on fighting. Good luck. Which do you want? Zelensky is a survivor. He will kick and he will scream and he will replay the Vance Zelensky Oval Office routine of, I have been, woe is me, I have been, dumped on from a large height, and this is terrible and this is awful, but there's nothing else I can do. This is the best deal I can get for Ukraine. Please start the martial music and I'll do what I can. But he knows deep in his heart that whatever he says to the European Union, that's going to be the deal. This summit is about Trump and Putin resetting the business relationship.
Why Alaska? Because there's a suggestion that the trade and exchange of natural resources would happen, perhaps even the construction of some sort of like a channel between, across the Bering Strait between Alaska and Russia. I mean, think of the resources in Eurasia.
Well, I think, Richard, to be honest, that certain members of the mainstream media aren't getting called for questions in the press briefing room, and they're getting drunk and they're coming up with all sorts of wild and blue. I don't know why it's Alaska. I think the important, I think what the rest of us have to do is look at the summit before, during, and after for clues. Clue number 1, a meeting that lasts more than half an hour between the two of them privately, something serious is going to happen. Clue number 2 is that Putin is going to American soil. Putin doesn't like leaving Russia because there's an international warrant out at the ICC for his arrest. And Trump has obviously said to him, we will not arrest you. But Putin is landing on American soil. That means that whatever happened in Trump 1.0, Trump has the upper hand this time around. And that's very important. Alaska, maybe it's the backdrop of mineral resources. Maybe it's sort of a halfway house. It's American soil, but it used to be Russian soil. There may be some symbolism there, but I wouldn't place too much in that. The other thing to look for in coming weeks is some sort of statement coming either from Trump or somewhere. But I believe whether or not Zelensky is there, whatever happens with Zelensky and the European Union, who are pretty much on the outside of this. I was talking with someone just earlier today, and they said, you're missing a factor, you're missing the European Union. And I said, no, I'm not. They're irrelevant. Trump doesn't care about Europe. Well, they're very, very angry, and they don't want any land to be given away at all. Yeah, guess who's not at the summit? They're not important. Look out in the next couple of months, next couple of weeks. Maybe what happened after this, but I think it will wait a while for Trump to adopt a position perhaps remarkably view of. I went to this summit. I looked this man in the eye. I believe he is sincere. There is no more he can do. Ukraine and Russia have history that goes back hundreds of years. Yes, the invasion was wrong. It should never have happened. Bad things happened in like 2014, 15, and 16. The European Union didn't act right. Ukraine didn't act right. There shouldn't have been an invasion. There was, but there are no engines in this fight. I looked this man in the eye. He said, this is the best I can do. If I try to do more than this, I'll be taken out by the military. And I, Donald Trump, believe him. That's the deal on the table. And here's what I believe, regardless of what European Union and Zelensky may say to me. I, Donald Trump, on behalf of America, believe that's the best that Russia can do. And so I no longer feel constrained to punish Russia. The door is out to do business again. That's, I believe, going to be the approach after Friday, whatever theatre takes place.
And if that's the deal, is this going to be? Do you think it'll be successful? Is this the end of the war? Is this the beginning of a new era of Russian-American cooperation?
I was asked, Richard, if I thought that Putin was setting this up so he could do a grand walkout. But why? What does he possibly gain by going to American soil in Trump's backyard and then walking out? He's already done all of that. He snubbed Obama. He snubbed Biden. He doesn't gain anything by any more snubs. Here's another angle that you won't see in the mainstream media. People think that Putin has too much to lose stopping now. He wanted to get all of Ukraine. Yes, he did. He wanted to get all of Ukraine in 14 days. That was 3 years ago. History will view this entanglement in Ukraine as a massive failure of the Russian military services and a massive failure for Putin. All he can do is rescue what he can. Well, okay, so these people say to me, but still, if he stops now, it will be seen as a massive defeat. Could be seen as an embarrassing defeat. What bothers Putin more, in my view, is why he's going to Alaska, is he doesn't want an embarrassing victory. Right now, Ukraine is running out of resources, not money, not arms, people. They don't have people to pick up the guns. My understanding from military calculations within Russia and in London is that by Christmas, certainly by next spring, even if it slows down, Russia will not be able to avoid winning. Putin doesn't want to win now, because if he wins, he'll be a pariah. If he stops where he is and seems to not get everything that he wanted, it's even Stevens, he might get away with his media business. If he's forced to win, he'll be a pariah. He doesn't want to win. That's why he's in Alaska. Now, you're not going to see mainstream media saying Putin is in Alaska to avoid winning. Yes, that's exactly right in Russia. So he's not going to walk out. And if he comes away from this, everyone's going to look like they've lost a little bit. But it will be a victory for Putin and Trump, a tremendous defeat for the Ukraine people. I mean, there's a human element here. There is a human element. These lands have been controlled by Russia. There are many people who live there who speak Ukrainian. They've lived there for generations. They're either going to live now in parts of the world which are going to be described as Russian, or they're going to have to leave. That is a terrible human tragedy. I don't diminish it. they are going to be the losers out of this. Zelensky will probably lose immediately. I think he will probably be forced out of the next presidential election in Ukraine. But history will view him as a national hero because he managed, with others, to stop Russia gaining all of Ukraine. It's a mess, but that's what I believe is going to happen. And how does that relate back to other things? Because one of the things that Putin and Trump are going to discuss in their private meeting is, hey, Donald, are you going to leave my $70 billion in assets alone? Don't you worry. Side story. One of the first things that Donald Trump did in March of 2017 in Trump 1.10 was he shut down a court case in New York that was not picked up by the mainstream media, and he fired the U.S. attorney, Preet Bharara, who started the case. That case in New York was brought against a New York company that was the end destination from the money that had been stolen from Hermitage. And if it hadn't been closed down, the Magnitsky Act would have come into play. Donald Trump shut it down to protect Putin's assets. So if one says, but where is the connection between Donald Trump to Robert Maxwell, to Russian money laundering and Putin? That's one of the connections that I do know about. And Donald's going to say, okay, Vlad, I'll protect your assets, but you're not going to reveal my connections to the Russian mob. No? Okay, well, so long as we can keep that quiet, that's fine. That's one of the reasons they're meeting in private as well, in my opinion.
That's a fascinating exploration of this tangled web. Geoff, how do we get a copy of Maggie's Hammer?
Well, Maggie's Hammer, and your listeners, your viewers may have sort of lost track. Basically, my Maggie's Hammer is a book about asking questions after my friend turned up dead in the woods, following the trail and painting this picture of what was going on in London in the 80s, which was the center of covert activities for what was going on in the world in the 80s, which, if you carry the money and the names forward, brings you to Epstein, Russiagate, and other scandals, and the Alaska Summit this Friday. You can find it by Googling Maggie's Hammer, which is spelled Maggies, Hammer. My name is Geoff Gilson. It's Ggeoff. Google Geoff Gilson, Maggie's Hammer. You will find it through Amazon or through my wonderful publishers, Trine Day. That's very easy to find. And if you want updates that I've got on, I don't have a blog. I use my Facebook account as my blog. And that also is under my name, Geoff Gilson. Easy to find, easy to access, because it's public access.
Geoff, great pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Richard. You have a nice afternoon.
A new Richard Syrett's Strange Planet drops every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.